for joining. So good afternoon from the UK. So I'm in the UK right now. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom and for those who are joining from Facebook. So my name is Zoé. I'll be your chair for this evening. And I am a master's student in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at SOAS. Please let me know, by the way, if you have any trouble hearing me. So yes, thank you so much for joining us on this Pugwash webinar on Iran and nuclear weapons, the present and the future. I am today joined by Sahil Shah, who is the Policy Fellow at the European Leadership Network, and he's an expert on the JCPOA. Thank you so much for joining. And before I let you speak, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping rules. So we will have a 20 minutes presentation from Sahil, followed by a Q&A. Please, during this Q&A, I'll ask you to ask your questions in the chat box so that we can, I can just ask Sahil in orderly manner. I'll also ask everyone to keep their microphone, I will manage, on mute. Thanks for this. And also I'll have to say that if there's any disruptive behavior, I or myself or one of the moderators, Andrew or Neve, will have to take you out of the webinar. So sorry about this. But yes, thank you so much for joining. And without further ado, Sahil, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to Pugwash for hosting this series. It's my pleasure to participate in what I think is already a great collection of conversations on topics that are relevant to global security at the moment. And I've worked with Pugwash in the past and think that you all make great contributions to the discourse on nuclear weapons, but also more broadly global security and stability. As Zoe has mentioned, my name is Sahil Shah. I'm a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network based in London. Before I begin, I should mention that I'm speaking on my personal behalf and that my views don't necessarily represent those of other members of the ELN. And I'm pleased to see that some of our senior network members have joined us here today. So thank you to you and to everybody else for joining. So as Zoe said, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and I'm going to be making 10 points during my presentation. So the first point is that Iran is undergoing domestic political change that we must pay close attention to, as it is dialogic with both their negotiation positionality and position on negotiating. And these are two different things. So first, when I refer to positionality, I'm referring to Iran's understanding of the social and political context that creates its own identity within the international system and how this identity influences its understanding and outlook on what it means to negotiate with countries like the United States, the E3, but the international community more broadly. Iran feels that despite the multilateral negotiations, the backing of a UN Security Council resolution and participation by the International Atomic Energy Agency in the negotiations and implementation of the JCPOA, that the overall system is simply stacked against them. In turn, it feels that its own positionality is not one that grants them fair negotiations and resulting deals that will be implemented in good faith. This point is particularly important because it reminds me of something that my good friend and colleague Asfandyar Batman-Galich once made, which is that Iran never wanted the results of the JCPOA to make them look like a bad country constrained by a good deal. Iran wanted the JCPOA to help socialize their presence in the international system as a regional power that they see themselves as. In turn, this influences the second part, which is what Iran's position is now on negotiating. As you are all likely aware, Iran has just had a parliamentary election that has resulted in an extremely conservative parliament. A number of these newly elected officials and their influencers have said for many, many years that Iran should not negotiate with the United States and Europe, and the current effects of maximum pressure on the economy and the health of the nation have validated that approach. In the last few days, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini has said that negotiations mean we have, quote, to put aside our nuclear power and industrial power, regional power, and military deterrence, and that Iran would therefore not be negotiating with the United States. Hamid Reza Azizi rightfully pointed out that this pronouncement is a shift in language, because before the rationale for not negotiating with the United States was always more ideological, but now it's been expressed through real geostrategic policy. And given from the levels at which it's coming from, I think that we should take this as fact. I should also note that the difference between this conservative parliament and the current Rouhani administration was best seen when Foreign Minister Zarif spoke recently in front of parliament and wasn't really able to get in a word edgewise, as he was repeatedly called a liar and basically talked down upon. Now, it's hard to say if the conservative parliament indicates that there will be a conservative presidential administration that comes in 2021 in Iran, but it's a very, very likely possibility as backlash, just like Zarif received in parliament, for what the overall administration's failures have seemingly been. This leads me to my second point. The United States, at the same time, is also undergoing domestic political change that we also must pay close attention to. As everyone is aware, we currently have a US president who is completely focused on his re-election, especially as former Vice President Joe Biden is growing a more commanding lead in the polls. Of course, President Trump calls them fake polls, and many of us Americans are not so reliant on these polls, especially after the last election. Regardless, Iran has been put on the back burner, as any bandwidth being put forward towards nonproliferation, again, during a very constrained period because most effort is being put towards his re-election, that limited bandwidth is currently being guided towards arms control with China and Russia. And even there, we're seeing a shift from Trump in his recent interview and also his national security advisor's recent op-ed to actually focus more on bilateral arms control with Russia. In Europe, everyone hopes that this rhetorical shift is part of a strategy to give the administration space to let New START trend up so that they can extend it without looking as though that they failed to include China. But it's interesting because there's not a similar process underway when it comes to the JCPOA. The US is doubling down on maximum pressure. They're not looking for a new deal, and they're not pursuing diplomacy with other world powers. In fact, they're trying to stop it at any cost. In addition, with New START, there's concern that the deadline of February 5th, 2021 for extension means that if Trump does not want to extend the treaty in the end and also throws the election into a constitutional crisis, it'll make things very difficult procedurally, even if Biden ends up winning and assuming office, as his inauguration may be potentially delayed past that deadline for New START. So there's a similar issue concerning the JCPOA file, because even though there isn't a necessarily strict deadline, and there will be a range of issues for Biden to handle in his first 100 days, if and when that clock ever begins, the Iranian presidential election should put a lot of pressure on a transition team to get things back on track fairly quickly. And the simplest way forward would be a plan to restore the JCPOA on both sides in a compliance for compliance model. Likely it would need to be in a stepwise fashion. This leads me to my third point. The path the JCPOA has been on these past few years has severely undermined the credibility of Europeans in Iran, and therefore also the trust needed for Europeans to come up with and sell any kind of intermediary arrangement between now and the election, or during the lame duck period if Biden is to win, and also after Biden is able to re-enter the US into the JCPOA and try to work out the details. So Europeans, with their very limited credibility at the moment, must think very carefully about every statement, every resolution, whether in Vienna or New York, every convening and every move made on this file, because as I will explain in a case study later, this is like the butterfly effect. A small move or the fluttering of a butterfly's wings in Vienna or New York could cause a tornado in Iran. Fourth point, there is a looming question in Iran if Biden will be able to break down the sanctions wall that the Trump administration has been purposefully building to make it difficult for the US to fully restore their end of the bargain. As this process of trying to get the JCPOA back on track will also coincide with the upcoming Iranian presidential elections, there's going to be an emphasis from all parts of the Iranian political spectrum on the fact that the US will not only need to make the first move, but also showcase how they will implement their end of the deal in full, given this sanctions wall that is being built up. This leads me to believe that those within the Biden camp who believe that Iran's economy is in a death spiral and that they have some sort of leverage to slowly wait things out and negotiate something better would be making a catastrophic mistake if they don't immediately make moves to restore the JCPOA, and they need to avoid raising other peripheral questions or concerns. The primary reason for this is that even if we make it to not just November, but also January or whenever Biden would be inaugurated, the JCPOA will truly be in a fragile state and must be carefully nursed back to health. In turn, Europeans must work hard to restore their credibility with Iran and showcase their commitment to the JCPOA by actively working with Iran publicly and privately over the next few months to not just keep things on ice, but to actually freeze them where they are. While many hoped that the E3, as well as the Iranians, Russians, and Chinese, could land on some kind of a formalized intermediate formula or middle ground on the JCPOA, there's not been any substantive public output from the Joint Commission process, even after the E3 triggered the dispute resolution mechanism at the beginning of the year, and now Iran has also done the same, triggered it against the E3 just a few weeks ago. So although one would hope that Iran's lack of major operational changes to its nuclear program, and I won't get into the technical details of Rafael Grossi's June report, but that the present lull seems to be more indicative of Iran's strategic patience rather than emblematic of some kind of behind the scenes agreement. So with patience running out and the Supreme Leader saying that Iran will expand its nuclear program again, if Iran is to return to a phased reduction of its JCPOA commitments, much like we saw through the end of 2019 and to the beginning of this year, this would severely damage the ability of everyone to defend the JCPOA. Thus, the E3 should be spending their political capital to come up with a formalized agreement that acknowledges Iran's right to have reduced implementation to a certain extent, but calling on them to reverse and stop certain actions. This would be a better use of European time rather than trying to come up with a side arrangement, for example, for the arms embargo issue, which they've been trying to do to appease the United States, which the E3 especially should now know is being led by an administration that is fundamentally opposed to any diplomatic outcome to that issue. In short, it's high time for the Europeans to realize that it cannot truly appease a United States administration that does not want diplomacy. In turn, it may also be wise for the E3 to concede that Iran has acted in good faith by implementing the JCPOA for an entire additional year before invoking paragraphs 26 and 36 under the agreement and reducing its implementation. It'll be a very difficult ontological step for Europeans to make, but I think that it would be highly appreciated by those in Tehran and would be seen as Europeans meaningfully understanding the position that Iranians have been put in. My sixth point is that while all remaining parties to the JCPOA, including Russia and China, have expressed concern to Tehran and advising them that they shouldn't go too far whilst playing in the margins of the JCPOA, not all Europeans have publicly come out and rejected the United States' assertion that somehow it's still part of the JCPOA and that they can still snap back UN sanctions. Although E3 and other European officials largely agree that the current US thinking is a legal and political absurdity that damages the credibility of the UN Security Council and the potential for snapback to be included in any future non-proliferation agreement, they have to stand up to the United States at any given opportunity. In fact, one opportunity may be presenting itself in the next few days, as US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said just yesterday that the US will be introducing a resolution to the United Nations Security Council that seeks to stop the lifting of the arms embargo meant to expire in October as part of the JCPOA. And we've heard about this resolution for a number of months, but I think that this week it'll actually be formally introduced. So If the United States does not see movement with this resolution, they will then go for the snapback option. However, it'll be important for Europeans to stand together with the Russians and Chinese and essentially deny the effect of such a unilateral move politically, and if it comes to it, legally, by advancing the issue to the International Court of Justice. Tying things up through procedural hurdles, such as committees, or a legal kind of dispute could help buy time, but at the end of the day, it will give many in Iran a great deal of ammunition to not just leave the JCPOA, but also the NPT. This leads me to my 7th point. Iran is ever increasingly becoming a potential wildcard ahead of the 10th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which has now been rescheduled for January. Another competing timeline, which also overlaps with the trajectory of hopefully what we will see, which is a change in US administration. But if there isn't a resolution to this issue and Iran feels that it needs to withdraw from the NPT under its supreme national interests, then this would also be quite devastating for those proceedings as well. Short of that, the Iranians may also suspend the implementation of the additional protocol, which they are voluntarily implementing under the JCPOA, which would also make those proceedings quite contentious. In fact, the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee ratified a motion to oblige the government to cease its voluntary implementation of the additional protocol. This now leads me to one of the topics that was listed for today, which many have read about in the news in recent months and weeks, which is the emphasis being put by the IAEA and others on the lack of access that Iran has given to 2 particular sites where the Secretariat believes historical nuclear activities may have taken place or materials may have been stored. While I've heard from various officials in different offices in Vienna that the issue will hopefully be resolved soon, the way it has been handled has been very, very badly, in my opinion. And a lot of people in Iran have closely watched the situation. And I think that there needs to be a period of reflection on it, because it shows that short-term political gambits have long-term effects elsewhere. And this is what I was getting at with the butterfly, kind of idea, that a butterfly slapping its wing in one place can cause a tornado elsewhere. And that flapping of the butterfly's wing for me was when the E3 passed a resolution during the June IAEA Board of Governors meeting that, quote, called on Iran to fully cooperate with the agency and satisfy the agency's requests without further delay, including by providing prompt access to the locations specified by the agency, end quote. In reaction, one headline in Iran was very telling, and I thank Fareshte Sadeghi for the translation. Kayon's editor-in-chief wrote, withdrawing from the JCPOA is not a matter of importance anymore because there's nothing left to the JCPOA. Iran now needs to exit from the NPT, and Iran's withdrawal from the NPT will turn the US and EU's win-win game into a losing game. So the repercussions of this E3 resolution on Iran ignited hardliners, including, as I already mentioned, those in parliament that have actually advanced a resolution to stop the implementation of the additional protocol. And for the rest of the world, including here in Europe, the headlines have died down, and that IAEA Board of Governors resolution's short-term political life has basically evaporated. We're not talking about it anymore. But if you pay close attention to the Iranian reactions, and this is my 8th point, we should always be asking ourselves what the consequences will be for when we make certain moves during this very contentious period. And this is because nothing is occurring in a vacuum. Everything is seen as linked. So just to quickly get more into the access issues, there were 3 issues that caused Iran to engage cautiously with the agency. And now, because of the way that they feel it's been handled, they're probably going to engage even more cautiously. First, Iran was and still is concerned by the attempts to reopen the file on its previous nuclear activities, which it feels was closed by the agency and its Board of Governors in 2015. Personally, it's not an argument that I buy. I agree with our close colleague and friend Mark Hibbs, and feel so strongly on the point that this is my 9th key point, which is that the IAEA does not close files. As Mark has said before, terms of its safeguards agreements and additional protocols obligate the IAEA to perform ongoing evaluation that all nuclear material remains in peaceful activities. This may include requests for access to locations and information on the basis of new information, raising questions about the correctness and completeness of a state's declarations. Second, Iran feels that using information that is not publicly available and verified undermines the credibility and impartiality of the agency. And this is because the requests are based off of documents that Mossad stole from Iran, a warehouse outside of Tehran, and they feel as though that it could be have been mishandled through the process of the documents not being able to be verified. This is also an issue that has animated Russia in particular for quite some time. So this will be a harder hurdle to get over because it could be seen as opening the Pandora's box and setting a new precedence. Again, third, Iran worries, like I said, that this will set a new precedence of never-ending requests resulting from this atomic archive, especially as there are likely more sites of interest to the agency. So this leads me to my 10th and final point before we can get to the discussion, which is that everyone, the United States, Europeans, Russians, Chinese, the IAEA, must understand that no matter how much they would like to compartmentalize things, everything is inherently linked. None of this is happening in a vacuum. And the scale of feeling that has emerged from the past few years, especially in Iran, the sense of betrayal, disappointment, it's cumulative. And what we're seeing right now, especially during the pandemic, which followed a period of military escalation earlier this year, is that I don't think that people are necessarily taking Iran's, again, to link to my very first point, positionality very seriously. And I think by over-compartmentalizing, everybody is trying to tackle the issues in a very poorly strategic manner, and that everybody should have a better sense and appreciation for the threat perceptions and general sense of scale of feeling in Iran towards negotiation with the United States and Europeans, but also just interacting with the international community right now more broadly. So I will end there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for this presentation. That was really, really interesting. I can see that we already have two different points of discussion. I'll get to this now, but as a reminder, please write down your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to go through as many as possible. So yes, the first one, thank you very much, Jan, for your questions. Jan is asking, what is the real interest of Iran here? Is it getting recognized as a legitimate regional power? And is it worthwhile to try to come up with European participants in the JCPOA with a common position on the agreement or the embargo, and thereby challenging the US?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, I think that for Iran, probably one of the things that occupies decision makers' minds at the moment is that, the United States is, clearly engaging in a maximum pressure campaign, and perhaps also engaging in covert provocations, as we've seen a range of bizarre incidents, including at the Natanz nuclear facility in the past few weeks, that may try to be getting Iran to retaliate and then give further space for the US or Israel to take harsher action. So I think the interest of Iran at the moment isn't necessarily about being recognized or about being taken seriously. It's at the moment about trying to avert crisis, whilst also building up leverage and standing very firm on their geostrategic priorities and policies, in order to make sure that if and when there is a period where there is a change in US administration, that they have enough leverage to be able to try to get things back to a place where they see as fair.
Great, thank you very much for this. So now I'm going to pass on to the question of Arman. So first, it was more of a point of discussion. So Arman was wondering, how about the importance of social changes in Iran and how the economic situation in Iran might affect the presidential election and in turn the JCPOA? And to follow up a question, so the feeling of betrayal and the positionality of Iran that you are referring to is only valid and applicable to Iranian officials, but not to the Iranian people. So the question is, how do you see the future of the JCPOA given that opposition against the regime in Iran is building up in Iran?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's quite difficult to really be able to get a sense of what the current public opinion is in Iran towards the government. But, you know, when it comes to how the Iranian people or officials feel at the moment about negotiations with the JCPOA, there's obviously been a massive reduction in trust. And that trust extends to not only the agreement and the administration, the Rouhani administration that negotiated and finalized it, but also towards wider interactions with the international community, whether that's through treaties like the NPT that they also feel are actually seemingly unfair, or other things. So I think that there is going to be a lot of blowback from what we've seen here. And I think the JCPOA is a scapegoat for something, it's kind of like sacrificial lamb for something much bigger. And that's not just only in Iran. I think that's the same in Europe as well. The disintegration of the JCPOA has sparked a lot of conversations about European strategic autonomy, European defense, the the strength of the euro, independence of international from US based banking systems, etc. So I think that we're only now going to start to really reflect upon what the JCPOA has meant, both when it was being implemented more in full and also now where it's in crisis.
Great, thank you for this. Another question by Layli. How can a Biden administration handle Israel in a potential revamping of the JCPOA? And will they disregard Netanyahu's wrath because Netanyahu is himself a precarious situation?
So I think that this is also very important for Iran because what has been visible during the Trump administration has been that there's been a formalization of a triangular dynamic between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And while this may have existed behind the scenes before, when it comes to trying to exert pressure on Iran, it has really come to the surface through a lot of incidents that we've seen over the past few years after Trump has become president. So I think when it comes to the Biden administration, they need to essentially project an image that breaks that triangular dynamic. And Netanyahu himself, yes, his particular emphasis on destroying the JCPOA and potentially using military action to deal with Iran's nuclear program does put everything into a very precarious situation. But I think that Biden will, former Vice President Biden is a staunch transatlanticist. And I think one of the main priorities that he'll have is restoring relationships with allies. And given how much bandwidth the JCPOA has taken up for European governments over the past few years, I think that this space is one in which he's going to have to show some early good faith moves on. And hopefully when the US and Europe have a strong united front on getting the JCPOA back on track, that will be very powerful and will overshadow any chatter that comes out of the usual corners, which I won't get into.
Great, thanks. So I'll just go straight to Taiwan Kim's question because it's still related to Biden. I think a lot of people are thanking you for the presentation first. I kind of don't talk about this, but a lot of messages of thanks. And the question is, it sounds like Iran's position on American cooperation have incredibly deteriorated after they backed out of the JCPOA. Even if Biden does get elected and his cabinet is strongly considering getting back to the diplomatic trust between Iran and the nations involved in the JCPOA, would the same approach that the Obama presidency tried during first JCPOA attempt to be accepted as warmly during the second hypothetical Biden approach? And what would have to change specifically?
That's a really good question. I think that the United States, Iran, and everybody involved have derived a range of lessons about how the JCPOA was negotiated, particularly not as a treaty that was then ratified by the US Senate, for example, but as a deal, a political deal that was then backed by a UN Security Council resolution. So even with the logistics and the procedural nature of it, I think any future agreement Iran will want to see more formalized and with giving maybe more agency to the US Congress so that it's not just the US's side of implementation is not just at the whim of whoever is president. So that's one thing. And I think that also directly relates to how sanctions relief, how permissions for sanctions relief is put into domestic law in the United States. So I think that basically the overall approach would be the same because I don't think that the principles have changed. But, if Biden pursues any changes to the JCPOA, which, as I said, I don't think that should really be the priority at the moment, especially with all these other impending deadlines and overlapping timelines. If they were to do that, I think that they would really need to think very carefully about what they would want and what they would be willing to give and able to achieve as well, because it's not very clear that such an outcome would be possible given the current kind of makeup of the US Congress as well. So.
Great, thank you. One comment that we receive is Iran must know that leaving the NPT and presumably pushing on with a nuclear program will make it an international pariah similar to North Korea. On that basis, it looks like an anti-threat. What do you think of this?
So yeah, I've contended with this for quite a few months. The threat to leave the NPT came up a while ago. And at that point, I think I agreed with the fact that it looked like an empty threat. But increasingly, just from having monitored the domestic discourse in Iran, the change in the makeup of the Iranian parliament, and also where public opinion leads me to believe the presidential election may go, I don't think that it's the same as what we saw with North Korea. I think that Iran will feel much more justified when it makes that case that leaving the NPT is in its, supreme national interests. I think that if you compare what North Korea wrote at the time to what I think Iran wrote, I think Iran's case is going to be extremely, extremely well developed and long. And I don't think that they would then throw out the IAEA completely. I think that they would still leave just a certain amount of inspections that would be able to give the general contours of where the program is at to ward off, say, potential military threats or action against the program. So I think the way that it would play out would be a bit different. And I think that their strategy and positionality is also a bit different.
If I may use my privilege as a chair to just follow up on this question. So do you feel like so basically society's pressure would be one of the things that would have an impact on decisions of the government?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I don't think that people very much value how well educated the Iranian public is on nuclear issues. In the United States, we bang our fists on the table just to try to get the public to understand basic policies like no first use or the command and control presidential authority of nuclear weapons, etc. But in Iran, because nuclear technology has been emblematic of national pride, sovereignty, etc., there's always been a long-standing discourse about it, and there's also been an effort by the government and others to actually educate the public about what these different things mean. So if in fact the Iranian public begins to more clearly articulate a case for why Iran should leave the NPT, I don't think it's necessarily something that would like shift everything. But I think it would give, whatever the government is, whether it's the current one or a potential future one, more cover to take a drastic move like that.
Great, thank you. I will ask now two questions together, if that's okay. So they're both based around China and Russia. So how do you see the deals that Iran is signing with China and Russia affecting, firstly, the balance of power inside JCPOA and in Iran's long-term orientation and positionality? And second, how would you interpret the Chinese agreement in the context you have described, and what is the real US response to this?
So these are really interesting developments, and I haven't necessarily had much time to process, especially the recent agreement between Iran and China, for example. But what I will say is that I think it's a long time coming. While Iran has publicly put a lot of responsibility on the Europeans to get the economic situation in Iran back on track, there have been severe, declines in bilateral trade between Iran and Russia, as well as Iran and China. And I think that while we may not have seen that pressure being articulated publicly, there have been ongoing discussions for a while now on how those countries that are truly seen in Iran by certain factions and not by others as allies to Iran on the JCPOA, but much more. These agreements aren't just born out of something in the short term. A lot has gone into it over time. In terms of how that affects the dynamics, it definitely affects the dynamics. I mean, I think that it completely changes the calculus that Iran has, because it's not just rhetorical support. It's not just China reading a 5-page statement at the IAEA Board of Governors. These countries are actually putting money where their mouth is. And I think that in turn, Iran will be expected to align with them as well and try to come up, for example, like I spoke about, Russia having had long-term, difficulties with how the IAEA deals with third-party information. So, Iran setting a potential new precedence in that regard may not be something that they're easily willing to do, because that may affect a case that Russia has been making for quite some time as well. So, it'll be interesting to see how the relationships play out, but I think these are very big developments and should be watched closely.
Great, thank you. Another question. So regarding your closing comments on the Biden presidency and rebuilding the US-EU links, do you think Iran expects a revitalization of the agreement?
So in terms of the JCPOA?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
You know what? I think that the current administration is definitely still publicly and privately signaling that if the United States returns to full restoration of the JCPOA, that Iran is willing to do the same. It'll be interesting to see, where that, at what point in the JCPOA timeline, what level that restoration occurs at. So do we count the past few years of the JCPOA hasn't been working? Do we not? Do we keep the years that are listed? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But I do think in terms of an overall framework that the current administration definitely sees it as the best way possible to help reopen the economy. And I think that they also know that, given Vice President Biden's personal attachment to the JCPOA is something part of the Obama legacy, and something that has greatly, again, like I said, disrupted not only relationships with allies, but also security in the Middle East in general and stability in the region in general. I think that Iran does take the kind of Biden pledge to join with no preconditions seriously, but that the Biden administration, if it becomes an administration, will need to tread very, very carefully about how they sequence their steps, because I don't think that the trust is necessarily there anymore. It doesn't matter if it's Biden, Clinton, Obama, Trump. At this point, it's, like I said, it's about how Iran feels about its positionality in the international system, which they feel that the US has far too much power and leverage over.
Great, thanks. So another question, can you please provide more details on your suggestion to involve the ICJ in the matter, be it only to buy time, as you suggested?
So, I'm not really for trying to go down the legal route, but the UN Security Council can call upon the ICJ to essentially issue some level of advice on how certain matters should be handled. And, if in fact that is something that the E3, for example, would want to move forward with, I think that would only happen if them politically denying the effect, say, of Snapback doesn't really work out in the ways that they want it to. So, it's difficult to say what the mechanics of that would be, but it is an option. And it seems as though the European strategy is to simply buy time. It's not the greatest of strategies, but let's see what happens. Yeah.
Okay, I think so. This is a question following up from Taewon Kim. Do you think that the recent reports of the Iranian government's attempt to squash civil movements and protests will have negative impacts in terms of future cooperative opportunities between Iran and Western-centric democratic nations, i.e. European nations and the US? And with that sort of image of the country, it seems almost plausible for me to see democratic civilian opinions sway greatly after they've exposed with Iranian actions that goes against their ethics of freedom of speech and so on.
So one thing that's been very interesting to watch in recent weeks has been international coverage of the way that Trump has put down protesters, for example, or just tried to disperse them forcibly outside the White House, etc. And I think that in Iran, there is also a long-term, discourse and understanding of American civil rights and where they currently stand, etc. So my first point is that I think it's a two-way street. I think that these concerns in the United States have always been known about the way that the social contract between government and civil society has worked out in Iran, especially after the revolution. But, there's always been a very vibrant exchange of students, of scientists, of, culture makers. And I think it'll be very important for peer-to-peer contact to resume while we try to get things back on track. One thing that complicates this, obviously, is the seemingly Iranian policy of arbitrarily detaining Americans or Europeans, etc. And I'm not sure what space there is to deal with that politically, but that is one thing that obviously makes it more concerning for that exchange to happen in a leveled way. So.
Great, thanks. I think we did focus a lot on Biden winning the election. So question is, should Trump win, could you sketch out what you see happening with the JCPOA and relations between US and Iran and European strategy in this?
That's a great idea. Great question. Sorry. It's not one that I've given much thought to. I've been writing a paper, which will be out in the next few months with some colleagues on a roadmap for what a Biden transition team could do. So that's where my head has been at. And I'm hoping that that is the outcome, obviously. But if Trump should win, I think that to a certain extent, a second-term president also has more breathing room to take risk in terms of foreign policy, especially. And, hopefully there isn't some kind of miscommunication or miscalculation that leads to a very sobering moment that gets everybody back to the negotiating table. Hopefully there'll be a natural progression and Trump will want a new deal to fulfill the deal maker status and personality that he sees himself as. So I would just have very limited hope that historically, from having known what second-term presidents have been able to achieve, that also with a change in, say, personnel, so say if we don't have Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State anymore, that, if there's changes in personnel, changes in the appetite for risk, but also the same appetite for foreign policy wins, that maybe there will be some kind of a sweet spot or moment. But I think that it'd be very, very difficult because the US administration at present isn't interested in Iran keeping any of its enrichment capabilities. And it's also very much interested in broadening the scope of the JCPOA past nuclear to things like ballistic missiles. And Iran obviously feels that unilaterally pausing the development of or rolling back its ballistic missiles makes no sense in a region where Iran is one of 11 countries with long-range systems. It finds such an assertion to be unfair and counterintuitive to its own deterrent strategies. So perhaps one thing that Trump could do during the second administration is try to regionalize the conversation, both on nuclear in the Middle East, but also missiles in the Middle East, etc. And maybe that could be a pathway for indirectly gaining some traction with Iran.
Great, and I'll just follow up on the same question. So, you talked about the fact that Europeans are losing a lot of credibility in Iran at the moment, and basically it seems that they don't really have any power in this. What do you think Europe can do to just make things moving? If, for example, Trump stays in power, do you think Europe might have to, just step up a little bit more? Or do you think there isn't really any way, if the US does not move, then Europe wouldn't manage to do anything?
Very difficult to say what Europe could do during another 4 years of Trump that they haven't already tried to do. Before the US withdrew from the JCPOA, Europeans engaged in a range of shuttle diplomacy to try to fix the deal, and that didn't work out. In addition, the Europeans have tried to fix the arms embargo issue, that the resulting ideas were not seen as something that the US could accept. So I really wonder what Europeans could possibly do, but I think that figuring out ways to safeguard and increase the resiliency of trade with Iran will be incredibly important. And that's why INSTEX, as a kind of first stab at that on the humanitarian side of things, has been so important. But as everybody knows, there have been lots of problems that I and my colleague Yar that I referenced earlier have written about. And if it has been so difficult for Europe to engage in trade on non-sanctionable goods and services for that matter, it's very difficult to see how they would be able to make any movement in the other range of economic sectors and areas that the Europeans originally promised that they would make an effort towards, even after the US left the JCPOA. Humanitarian was one of, I believe, 13 areas. And nothing has really progressed.
Great, thank you.
I'm more hopeful that China and Russia
Mm-hmm.
would have more added value in that scenario,
Okay.
mainly because of the way that Trump perceives the Russians and Chinese, compared to how he perceives allies, European allies, but also because of the credibility that the Russians and Chinese have in Tehran as well.
Great, thank you. So it might be one of the last questions, pretty interesting and very relevant to us right now. So regarding peer-to-peer dialogue, increasing trust, do you have any recommendation for how international student young Pugwash can take a role to improve a future situation by building connections now, perhaps with other civil society organizations?
Absolutely. I think that there are definite ways for young people through peer-to-peer contact to really engage and put forward proposals and float ideas that governments cannot. And I'll give an example. I see that some of my colleagues from when I used to do US-Russia peer-to-peer dialogue are on the call. And when the US and Russia's relationship became incredibly rocky after Crimea, a lot of the peer-to-peer programs between the US and Russia were cut. So Flex was cut, Born Scholars were cut, Fulbright was cut, and the Stanford US-Russia Forum was one of the only ones that still continued to exist. And we would bring Americans to Moscow, put them in working groups, students would research together on various topics, virtually actually, much like we're all operating right now, over the course of 8 months. And then at the end of the process, those Russian students would come to Stanford, to Palo Alto, and present their ideas and recommendations to former government and business leaders and entrepreneurs, etc. So I definitely think that those kinds of processes help. They build real formative relationships amongst young people. And I think one of the biggest losses that nobody really talks about when we speak about the JCPOA, especially in such technical terms, is that through the process of the JCPOA's ups and downs, we've truly disheartened an entire generation of Iranians that saw a lot of hope in what the JCPOA could mean for their future. And I think that we all need to show a very strong commitment to a desire to hear from and cultivate relationships with young Iranians. I think it's incredibly important. And if in fact we lose a generation of people anywhere for that matter, and we lose their trust in international institutions, processes, etc., and we all revert back to a more isolated world, then I think that the effects will be much broader than anything that we've discussed today. So absolutely, I think there are lots that can be done. And I think one idea that I'll point you towards is that there is a think tank attached to the Iranian Foreign Ministry called IPIS. And I'm sure that if you got in touch and you wanted to try to engage, like I said, through some kind of virtual working groups on different topics, that that would be very interesting for them. And I think that that's something that should be pursued.
Great. I think that was a great way to end this webinar. I know there are a few more questions. I'm sorry, I don't think we'll have time to answer now, but I believe you said that you would be happy for people to contact you.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a few of the questions here. I don't think I'll be able to save them. So
okay.
If you would like to write to me, you can find my email address on the European Leadership Network's website. I'm happy to engage over email, so please feel free to write to me, and thank you for all the excellent questions. I hope that I've been able to answer them in an acceptable way, so thank you for having me.
Thank you so much again for this. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. And I think it was a very fascinating presentation. And I do think you answered the questions in a very interesting way. So thank you so much again. And I hope to see you again on other Pugwash webinars or just in general. And thank you for the great work you're doing as well. I just wanted to thank you again, everyone who joined us on Zoom and on Facebook. And I think that was a great webinar. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.